Good morning. It's always strange saying that up here, and it's strange seeing y'all in daylight every time. I never get used to it, but I'm honored to speak in the morning when I do. This morning, our thought, and this evening as well, our question is, how will you be remembered? How will you be remembered? The damnatio memoriae was the worst punishment in Roman society. And it translates to something like the damnation, the condemnation of the memory. It was destroying someone's memory from off the face of the earth. Domitian was an emperor in the first century of Rome. And this is an altar dedicated to Sol, the sun god, and to Domitian. And you can see down here in the bottom left, at least you might be able to see, that some of the words have been erased from this altar. That was where Domitian's name was, because he suffered the damnatio memoriae. His name, his memory, was erased from Roman society. So when he died, the Senate, who hated him, got up on ladders and they took down his royal decorative shields and threw them, and they smashed all of his statues to pieces. They destroyed his memory. Now this happened to multiple emperors, Domitian included, but it also has something to say about the gladiators who fought here in this Colosseum. There were, inside the Colosseum, there were, let's just say for our terms, it's like a Saturday night football game, and up to 80,000 people gathered to be entertained by other things, but the main show, the end of it all, was the gladiator bouts. So this was the perspective of the gladiators. There was a floor that was on top of all the little nooks and crannies you see down there. There's a floor covered with sand, and 80,000 people or so are gathered all around, like an NFL game, to watch this really violent and gruesome event take place. Now, we often think, if you're someone who thinks of the gladiators on a semi-regular basis, we often think of them as oftentimes dying in the fight, during the fight. But most of the time, they actually didn't pass away during the fight because they were, in a sense, celebrities of their world. And so the emperor and his people wanted to protect their prized act. So they rarely died in action. But sometimes when a gladiator suffered injuries that would have kept him from fighting again, the crowd could vote for, at least some say, historically speaking, the crowd could vote for whether that gladiator would live or to die. And they would vote sometimes for him to die if he had suffered injuries like that, not even as a way of punishing him most of the time, but actually as a way of honoring him, because he would die in this notable, noteworthy, honorable way in front of all of these people, and his memory in that way would be preserved, the opposite of condemning his memory, that people would remember him from that time on. And this was important to them because in their frame of thinking, their pagan religion, punishment in the afterlife lasted as long as someone was not remembered. If you were forgotten, you were suffering punishment in the afterlife. So they would erase the names of public figures that they denounced, and they would celebrate the names of people that were beloved. One more example from ancient Rome, just because it's impacted so much of our modern world. This is the Emperor Augustus, or at least a statue of Augustus, who by Roman standards was one of the great emperors. And this is the Augustus inscription. Now this is, as you can tell, it was taken I took this with the parallel camera camera on my iPhone. And so this is a gigantic inscription that spans a very long way. And it wasn't originally on this wall. It was inscribed on two brass pillars that were in front of Augustus's mausoleum, which is this big building that housed his tomb. And basically, you can look this up if you want to read the whole thing. It'll probably take you a few years, but basically, it's a big old argument as to why Augustus should be considered to be a god after he dies. It was completed about a month before he passed. It was his argument as to why he should be divinized. He should be viewed as a god after he passed on to the next life. Now he did this because he wanted to be remembered. He wanted Augustus to live on. After Augustus had passed from this life, physically speaking, he wanted himself to live on. And that brings us to that question that we started with. How will you be remembered? How will you be remembered? This is the time of year where we push for new things, a lot of us. This is still a new year. It's a new month. It's a new week of the month. So we have these goals. Some of us have resolutions for the new year that you probably have given up on already if you have them, but hopefully you've stuck by at least maybe one of them, that you're working toward a new you in this new year. But inside a lot of us, I think the thing that in part leads to things like New Year's resolutions is this drive. We have a drive to do something, to be remembered for something, to be noteworthy for something that we accomplish in this life. We want people to miss us when we're gone. We want people to respect who we were. We want people to mourn when we pass from this life. I think there's something inside of all of us that wants that, especially maybe as we get older, it becomes more to the forefront of our brains. But something inside of all of us is driven by that. And not only for ourselves, but also for each other. We don't want anyone to be remembered. Even someone that you maybe dislike, you don't want them to be forgotten. There's something inside of all of us that wants to preserve the memory of every single person. There's something uniquely heartbreaking for a lot of us about a family name, a family line coming to an end. And it's kind of arbitrary. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but there's something inside of us that mourns, that grieves for that when a family name comes to an end. There's something special for us about that. And so we do things like Augustus. We do things like write a gigantic argument about why we should be considered a god after we pass from this life. Most of us probably don't do that, but some of us are pursuing what's called cryogenic preservation. If you're a very rich person in our world, you apparently now have the opportunity to freeze yourself and hope that in the future they can figure out how to unfreeze you in a way that brings you back and that you can continue living. And maybe at that point, you can live forever. Who knows where our medical industry will be at that point. But there are, by some estimates, 5,500 people on Earth who are currently pursuing cryogenic preservation, that they want to be frozen and brought back. So, some of us are inclined in that way, but I think that this isn't just about insane people like Augustus or insanely rich people who are trying to be frozen. We all pass on stories to the next generation. We pass on our principles, our life lessons, our passion projects, inheritances. We're passing things on because something inside of all of us fears death. It fears the end of what it means to be Daniel Webster. Because to be human is to be, right? Like, what am I as a human if I'm not a human being? If I don't continue to be, what am I? Why am I here? So this existential thought sometimes brings us into dark places. It reminds me of, I was thinking about Psalm 89, verses 47 and 48, where the psalmist says, "Remember how short my time is. For what vanity you have created all the children of man. What man can live and never see death? Who can deliver his soul from the power of Sheol, the underworld? Who can deliver us from the power of the grave?" He says, "For what vanity you've created all of us." In other words, this is all pointless. Why do we all exist if we're all just going to cease to exist at some point and nothing that we do makes a difference? It can lead us into dark places. And it's, for me at least, in part, because we like things that we can control. We like to be in control of something in life. If it feels like everything else is out of our control, we grasp on to even the smallest things that we can control, because this is scary. Carl Jung, who's a famous psychologist, said that life is a short pause between two great mysteries. Life is a short pause between two great mysteries. You know, I think all of us in this room have some kind of faith, at least, in what's to come. For me, I really do believe that we are getting up from our graves one day. I really do believe in resurrection. But if we're being honest, deep down, it's still something of a mystery. I haven't experienced it. You haven't. In some sense, life is a vapor, as James would say. Life is a short pause between two great mysteries. Now, like I said, as someone who enjoys control over my life, that sounds horrible. I don't like that. And so what I want to think with you about this morning and this evening are two twin impulses that tug against each other, but I think also we are called to hold in harmony, to work together. And that is, on the one hand, letting go, on the other hand, pressing on. Letting go and pressing on. Those won't be points for our sermons, but they're the two twin impulses that I want us to explore together today, letting go and pressing on. Now, as we think about being remembered, I want us to turn in our thoughts to the book of Nehemiah. And you can turn there if you want. Any text that we read will be on the screen behind me. But Nehemiah is particularly significant for this discussion because really the thread that's tying the book together, at least in a lot of ways, is this idea of remembering, of being held in remembrance. And it starts with a reminder to God. You can see the text on the screen, a few places where Nehemiah calls on God to remember something. But then also, he reminds the people that they are supposed to remember things about God. You can see the text on the screen. And mainly, and this is one, or Troy read for us this morning, one example of this. Mainly, Nehemiah asks God to remember him, to remember Nehemiah. So let's break down what's going on in this book of Nehemiah. And I think when we bring it all together, it'll be helpful in thinking through this idea. Ezra and Nehemiah, actually, they're back-to-back in our Bibles, but they were originally one book of the Bible. Ezra and Nehemiah, one book. They were divided during the Protestant Reformation about 500 years ago. But originally, Ezra and Nehemiah were combined into one book. And they tell the story together of the returns of the Israelites from Babylon to Jerusalem. They were in exile. They were deported by the Babylonian government and military. And now, at least some of them, are returning from exile back to Jerusalem. And this tells the story of what's going on. And it specifically, the book focuses on three heroes of the faith. And if you were in the All-Comers class, I broke down some of this. So you might remember our three, it looks like a movie poster in some ways, of Ezra, Zerubbabel, and Nehemiah. These are the three main heroes of what I call Zezramiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, because Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah are the three heroes. The book's design focuses on the efforts of each leader. So this is kind of a breakdown of the three main portions of the book, Zezramiah. In the first portion, it focuses on Zerubbabel, because Zerubbabel returns with some people, and he rebuilds the temple. And then, in Ezra 7 through 10, it's about 60 years later, and Ezra is refocusing the people on the law. So that's what he is rebuilding, the moral integrity of the people. And the third leader, Nehemiah, is focused on early in the book of Nehemiah as he is rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. So Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple, Ezra rebuilds the law, and Nehemiah rebuilds the wall of Jerusalem. So those are the three heroes of this story. Now what's interesting is that these three stories are actually designed to parallel each other. So if you read through them, they all begin with a Persian king commanding that he's prompted by God, and he commands that some people return to Jerusalem. Some of God's people return. So this happens in the early part of Ezra, and in the second part of Ezra, and in the first part of Nehemiah. This happens in each story. And then the second thing that parallels each other is that each of these leaders faces opposition. That makes it difficult for them to accomplish God's purpose, which they overcome, and that leads to the third thing. They overcome it in a way that leads to a strange anticlimax in each of the three parts. So each of these three movements, the first one focusing on Zerubbabel, the second on Ezra, the third on Nehemiah, they all have these three paralleling structures to their stories. And we'll unpack, just for a moment, Nehemiah's weird ending, the anticlimax of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah is operating at the same time as the prophet Zechariah, who also has the book of the Bible. You might have read it before. And Nehemiah and Zechariah working at the same time. Now remember, Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. But what's interesting is that Zechariah is prophesying, again, same time period, and in his vision, the new Jerusalem, the rebuilt Jerusalem, is a city without walls. You can see how that's a strange thing to sit with for Nehemiah and Zechariah. So this is Zechariah 2, 4 and 5. It says that Jerusalem shall be inhabited as villages without walls, because of the multitude of people and livestock in it. And I will be to her a wall of fire all around, declares the Lord, and I will be the glory in her midst. So this vision of Zechariah is that everyone's invited to the New Jerusalem. There's no wall because God protects them all. It's a big old party. Everyone's invited. That's Zechariah's vision. But Nehemiah seems to operate actually with the opposite vision, because he informs the people who are surrounding Jerusalem that they actually have no part in his Jerusalem, and he's going to build this wall to keep them out. And they revolt against that, and they see Nehemiah's vision through with integrity, with purpose, so we respect that about Nehemiah. But it's just an interesting anticlimax where Nehemiah is building this wall, and Zechariah says that Jerusalem is a city without walls. So as we read through the book, we're faced with that type of dilemma 3 times, and it presents us with this question. Why do we keep having these stories that end with mixed feelings? Why do we have these anticlimaxes that happen in the book of Zechariah? And that question leads to the conclusion of the book in 2 movements. And the first is positive, and the second is negative. This is chapters 8 through 11 of Nehemiah, and then chapters 12 through 13. So in the conclusion, Ezra and Nehemiah join forces to bring about a spiritual renewal amongst the people. And we're thinking that this could be what solves it all. This is a beautiful thing of 2 leaders coming together to work together to solve the problems. But in the end, the conclusion is, again, surprisingly negative. It actually, the book ends on a huge downer because Nehemiah is touring through the rebuilt Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that they've spent decades at this point trying to rebuild, trying to make it up to what they want it to be. And what he finds is that Zerubbabel's work is undone. Zerubbabel, who rebuilt the temple, because the temple is neglected and it's staffed by a bunch of people who are unqualified, who aren't supposed to be staffing the temple. So Zerubbabel's work is undone. Well, then they see that Ezra's work is compromised because everyone's violating the law. Everywhere you look, people do not have the moral integrity that Ezra worked so hard to instill in the people. So Ezra's work is undone. And then even Nehemiah's own work on the wall is at play here because the people are setting up shop outside of the walls. They're ignoring the walls, and they're doing it on the Sabbath, no less, which if you know anything about them, they're not supposed to be working on the Sabbath. So here they are. The work of all of these great leaders that they put decades into is compromised. So Nehemiah goes on a rampage, and just one example, verse 25 of chapter 13, I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God. Now this is powerful language. And you might be tempted to look in judgment at Nehemiah, but what I want us to do is not so much that, but more to step back and to look in the mirror and to say, how do I respond in a similar moment? We'll come back to that in a second. Because the book ends, Nehemiah 13, verse 31. Nehemiah prays, remember me, O my God, for good. Now that sounds great. That's one of those verses that you can put on your wall and it looks amazing, right? You can post it on Facebook or Instagram and it's very inspirational. But in context, what Nehemiah is actually saying is that he's toured the city and he's seen all this work that's been undone. So in context, what he's saying is, remember me for the good that I tried to do. My entire life's work has just unraveled in front of me. I've got to the end of all of my work and it's pointless. But remember me for the good that I tried to do, God. So that's his prayer. It's maybe not quite as inspirational on the surface at least. But I think when we dig deeper and think about it, it's actually very inspirational. It's actually a deep call to us. Because that's how the book ends. It ends anticlimactically. That's really the story of the book, these anticlimaxes. And that's on purpose. Because the book is inviting you and me to step into the feet, the sandals of these ancient people and to see what went wrong. Why, after all this work from these people who are doing their best to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the law, to rebuild the wall, all this work, all for naught, at least relatively speaking, in the end. And I think what it's inviting us into is a realization that in spite of all of these external reforms, where they fix everything on the surface, they missed what they really needed to focus on the whole time. And that is that the people needed a reform of the heart. There was inside of them. The construction zone was inside of them. Not just outside, but beginning on the inside. Because they're back in the land, like externally. They've returned from exile, at least some of the people have. They're back in the land, they got what they wanted. But spiritually, they're still in exile. Spiritually, they're still separated from their God. And on a related note, this is what the prophet Ezekiel says. And for us, as we look back, we apply this to Jesus, to our Christian age. He says, I will give you a new heart, God says through Ezekiel, a new heart and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. You shall dwell in the land that I gave you to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. So the point is that if God is ever going to live amongst his people, if the people are truly going to love and obey their God, what they need more than any external reform is a holistic transformation of the heart. That their spirit has to give way to God's Spirit within them. That he will put his Spirit within them, and he will give them a new heart. They will become a new people. And I think that's a powerful word for us. I think it's a powerful message for us to sit with together this morning. Because so much of what a lot of us do in life is building up towards something. If you look back over your lifetime, maybe you have at least parts of this life journey where maybe you graduate from high school, maybe from college, you find a job, find a partner, you find a city, a church, whatever it is. You settle down, have children, grow with them, and then you start it all again with grandchildren. Again, that's a very simplified version. Not all of us experience that. But a lot of us are building toward at least parts of that. We're building towards something in life. And we're doing that because we want purpose. We want community. We want to belong somewhere. We want fulfillment in our felt experience of this world. But my question is, what do I do if I wake up one day and it turns out that my life is more like Nehemiah's than I ever realized, than I ever wanted it to be? That all of this work that I put into, whatever it is, all of this life that I poured into this, whether it's a hobby, a job, a person, whatever it is, all of it's for naught. What happens when I experience that? What happens when moths and rust destroy, as Jesus says, when thieves break in and steal? What do I do at that point? Because Jesus says in another place, everything that we have, we will give in exchange for our souls, for our lives. But we don't live like that, at least a lot of the time. We don't live with that perspective, overarching perspective in mind. So what do I do in that moment? What do I do when, like the preacher of Ecclesiastes, he looks out at life, he looks back over his life, and he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. In other words, everything just doesn't make sense. It's just empty. I did everything I was supposed to do. And I get to the end, and it's all vain. It's all empty. So what do I do if I wake up in that moment, and my hopes have been dashed, my dreams have been scattered, and I realize that I have to learn to love the life that I actually have instead of the one that I always wanted? What do I do in that moment? And I ask this, at least in part, because there is no retirement age for a follower of Jesus. There's an existential angst that some of us can fall into in these moments when I wake up and I realize that my life is not what I always wanted it to be. And it can cause us to want to give up, to throw in the towel, to just say, okay, I'm just going to be here until I'm not here anymore. And that's what I'm here for. I'm just going to, you don't have to be old to experience this. That happened to anyone at any age. That I'm just going to sit here on my metaphorical log and just sit until I'm not sitting anymore. That can happen. But as followers of Jesus, we have a different perspective. We realize that there is no retirement age, that there is no end to what we're called to do here on earth, that we always have a purpose. Now, on these lines, I want you to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. This is not going to be on the screen because I want us to read it together in our own Bibles. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and we'll conclude with some verses and some thoughts from this text. I want us to go here because, among other things, Paul is unpacking what it means that a new world has been born in Christ Jesus. In Paul's thought, when Jesus gets up from his own grave, he is inaugurating a new reality. He is introducing into our world a different world, a new reality that has not been experienced before. And in 2 Corinthians 5, he's unpacking what that looks like in real life. It's kind of like if you just picked up tomorrow and moved to a different country halfway across the world. And let's say that you have to learn a new language. You have to learn new laws and new customs, because if you don't, nothing makes sense, right? You're not going to fit in. And for Paul, that's what this is like. It's this new reality that Jesus has introduced into the world. But it's like moving to that country, but times infinity. It's incredibly different than what our felt experience of reality has been. And so he says in verse 14 of 2 Corinthians 5, the love of Christ controls us. Now that's fascinating. The love of Christ is the most unshakable reality in Paul's life. It controls us because we have concluded this, that one has died for all. Therefore all have died. That means you and me. All have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. Now we're not going to camp too long here, but that means you and me. We no longer live for ourselves, but for him who for our sake died and was raised. From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. Now that's interesting. Paul says that if Paul were to come into this room right now and to meet you, at least in theory, he doesn't see you in the flesh, like the spirit or this physical body that we all have. Of course he does, right? But he's getting at something deeper. He sees that you are a physical entity, but he's getting at something spiritual about you and me. He's saying that when he looks at us, he doesn't see us as corruptible, as mortal, as just here today and gone tomorrow. In some ways, he's saying that we are not just experiencing a short pause between two great mysteries, because we believe that something bigger is coming. We believe that we never cease to exist. As C.S. Lewis said, you have never met an ordinary person. There are no mere mortals, is what he said. He says that everyone that you encounter is going to exist forever. It's immortals that we play with and work with and study with and all the other things. You never met an ordinary person. That thought is also what Paul's getting at, that there's something deeper inside of us, that in Christ, something entirely transformative is happening to you and to me. And he continues, he says, even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. Now, that's interesting. Why not? Why don't we regard him thus? Why don't we think of Christ as being in the flesh any longer? Because he got up, right? He got up from his own grave. And then he gives us, in verse 17, one of the great summaries about what the Christian faith is all about. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Literally, this says, if anyone is in Christ, new creation. Oftentimes you have to supply the to be verb in Greek and in Hebrew, so in the Bible. Literally, it just says, new creation. If anyone is in Christ, new creation. Now, I bring that up to say that I think it is talking about a person here. If anyone is in Christ, if a person is in Christ, that person is a new creation. But it's also bigger than that. It is individual, but it's also spiritual. It's also cosmic. That if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. That this new reality that Christ has introduced into the world by getting up from his grave, you are experiencing that if you are in him. You are a new creature as part of the new creation. And this new creation has been reconciled to its creator. That's what he goes on to talk about. He says, the old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. So we're joining in on what Christ started at Calvary. We might say that he began the song and we are riffing on it, that we are joining in on what he initiated. So for us, you might be a teacher or a salesperson or a mom or preacher or dad or whatever you are, a student. But actually, what you are in your place of business, in your home, in your school, whatever it is, what you are is a minister of reconciliation. That's what you're doing. That's what you're called to be. You're called to be the chief peacemaker in your home, in your work, in your school. You have been entrusted with the ministry of reconciliation. And we can say that because Jesus inaugurated this entirely different world when he got up from his grave. It's a new world. And because something new has happened to our reality, Paul's thought is that something new must now happen within our reality, that we would join in on what Christ started on the cross. Now, this is why, if you read 2 Corinthians, Paul doesn't make any sense to the Corinthians. They are confused on why Paul acts in the way that he does. And it's because he's acting like there really is a new reality. He's acting like someone who is part of this new reality, and it doesn't make sense to their version of the world. But Paul says that something new has happened, and so something new must now happen in my life. He says that this world has a new king, and that king has ambassadors, which is what he says next. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. Now, verse 21 is interesting because the flow of thought here is that I'm not worthy of this. Like, if you are feeling that you are unworthy of being a minister of reconciliation, that's where Paul's going in verse 21. I'm not worthy, but for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So it's not that you are the minister of reconciliation, the chief peacemaker, because you are just such a peacemaking person. It's not because you are just naturally a good and great and kind person. Maybe you are, but for a lot of us, when someone cuts you off on the road, you're not feeling like a minister of reconciliation, right? Or when someone's going 4 miles an hour in the fast lane, you don't feel, maybe just on the road is just where we really need peace. You don't feel like a minister of reconciliation. And on a more serious note, when your candidate is not in office, or when, politically speaking, our nation is going in directions you don't agree with, or whatever it is, even in that moment, you and I are called to be ministers of reconciliation, to be people of peace. And Paul invites us in verse 1 of the next chapter, chapter 6, says, working together with him, then, we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. Working together with Christ, he says, don't let this go to waste. You have received a grace. You, in this pew, you have received a grace. That you have been invited to be a minister of reconciliation in a world that is so divided, a world that is so dark in so many ways. You are called to bring people together with each other, to bring people together with God, that you are a peacemaker. And so he says, don't let that go to waste, that you have received this great privilege, this great responsibility, this grace. So don't let it go to waste. So that's my call to you. As we think about leaving a legacy, and we'll talk more about it tonight, that is your legacy and my legacy on earth. Whether anyone remembers us after we're gone or not, that we're called to join in, not on my agenda, but to join in on what Christ is doing, what Christ started when he got up from his own tomb, that he's bringing together the broken pieces of our world, and that you and I are called to be part of that, to be part of his good news. If that's something that you are interested in this morning and you want to dedicate your life to, why don't you do it as we stand and sing together?